When you live in the taiga, there are two rules. Don't ask unnecessary questions and don't be afraid of loneliness. But one day I had to break both. My name is Alex Myron. I have been working as a gamekeeper in the Barguzin Reserve since January 2015. 5 years and 7 months. Not much by the standards of others who have given decades of their lives to this place. But I sometimes feel like I've been here forever. Many people wonder what makes a person leave civilization and go into the taiga. Most think it's an escape from debts, problems, past mistakes. For me it was, but now I would call it an escape. Until I was 32, I worked in oil production in Western Siberia. 2 weeks in a shift camp, 2 weeks at home, an apartment in Irkutsk, a wife Anna, a daughter Senia, a mortgage for 15 years. An ordinary life with its small joys and equally small problems. October 7, 2014 changed everything. Anna and Catherine were returning from their parents from Ulan-Ude on the M55 highway. Early ice. Ice on the road, oncoming lane, and a gasoline truck. In an instant, I lost my family. After the funeral, there was a stupor. I didn't return to the oil company, shut myself in 4 walls, and methodically killed myself with vodka for 3 months. Michael, an old friend from the police, saved me. He simply came, pulled me out of my apartment by force, and took me to his acquaintance in the directorate of the Barguzin Nature Reserve. You need a place to think, and a job that will make you live, not exist, he said then. Give it a try. It can't get any worse. I accepted the position of Senior State Inspector, the official job title for a gamekeeper in modern Russia. I thought it would be for a month or two, just to appease my friend, but almost 6 years have passed, and I'm still here. The reserve covers more than 366,000 hectares of wild taiga. There are 3 sections, Barguzinsky, Davshinsky, and Southern. I got the northernmost, the most remote, the eastern slope of the Barguzin Ridge, together with the coast of Baikal. The nearest settlement was Davsha, and that was 30 kilometers away. The first months were a nightmare. No experience, harsh winter, a constant feeling that I was doing something wrong. A gamekeeper should know every stream, every trail, recognize the tracks of any animal. And what did I know? How to distinguish diesel from gasoline, and how to close an oil well in emergency mode. But the taiga is not in a hurry. It either kills the unprepared or accepts those who can learn. She decided to teach me. My daily job is to check the territory for violations of the reserve regime. I start my rounds at different times and along different routes. Sometimes I have to cover 20 to 30 kilometers in a day, spend the night in huts or in the open air. In summer, by boat along the coast. In winter, on skis or snowmobile. I always have with me SKS carbine, walkie-talkie, food stock, compass, knife, matches in a sealed package, first aid kit, and a tablet on which I record all traces, meetings with animals, changes in the landscape. For almost 6 years, I have experienced enough to realize that the taiga does not forgive frivolity and self-confidence. It checks every decision you make, and sometimes these tests turn out to be very tough. I want to tell you about some of the most serious tests. They changed me more than all the previous years of my life combined, and showed me that even in the most remote corner of the wilderness you can find more humanity, both good and bad, than in any city. The first of these occurred in the summer of 2016, when after a strange find on my doorknob, I found myself drawn into a game where more than just my life was at stake. What I discovered deep in the protected taiga wasn't just breaking the law. It threatened to destroy everything I had begun to consider my new home. July 2016 was unusually hot for the Barguzin Reserve. The thermometer at my cordon and Davshi tract showed plus 33 degrees Celsius in the shade for the 3rd day in a row. Baikal was unusually warm, as if it were a large lake rather than the deepest freshwater sea on the planet. Animals were hiding deep in the taiga, seeking coolness by streams and in the shade of northern slopes. I returned from a long detour in the dark. The route was hard, 28 kilometers through the mountain taiga in such heat exhausts, even a prepared person. Heading to the porch of my house, in the dim light of the lantern, I noticed something unusual on the door. At first I thought it was a piece of bark or a leaf brought by the wind, but when I came closer, I realized that it was a note wrapped around the handle and bound with a rubber band. It was clearly written in a hurry on a sheet torn from a notebook. Check the northern boundary at Cedar Cape, a tourist camp that isn't on your maps. They'll kill me if they find out. My first thought was to notify my superiors and request support. At 2 a.m, I contacted the director of the reserve. After listening to me, he abruptly recommended not to make a fuss and to verify the information first. There was a strange wariness in his voice. It's probably just someone's stupid joke, Alex Samuel. Anyway, let's go without official protocols for now. Check it out and report back to me personally. Something about that conversation alerted me. For a year and a half of work, I had never encountered such an approach to possible violations of the reserve regime. Usually, any information about tourists without authorization caused an immediate reaction. In the morning, I packed my backpack for a 2-day outing. The route to Kedrovy Cape was about 15 kilometers on difficult rugged terrain. Steep ascents, dense cedar forest, rocky areas near the coast. GPS tracker, binoculars, camera with long lens, provisions, water, sleeping bag, carabiner and knife. Standard equipment for such an outing. At 5:30 I was already on the trail. I moved cautiously, trying not to leave visible traces and not to make noise. If the tourists were really doing something illegal, the element of surprise could be a decisive advantage. By noon, I had reached the high ground 2 kilometers from Cedar Cape. I had to proceed with the utmost care. Adjusting my binoculars, I began to methodically survey the terrain. At first, I didn't notice anything suspicious. Coastal strip, rocks, forest. But then when the sun shifted slightly and the shadows became shorter, I saw a barely perceptible path leading from the shore into the forest. It was not a beast path. It was too flat, trampled by human feet. I decided to move along the ridge, maintaining altitude. It allowed me to control the path, remaining unnoticed. After half a kilometer, I noticed the first sign of human presence. A candy bar wrapper stuck between the rocks. It was new and had not had time to fade in the sun. After another kilometer, the trail widened and tread marks appeared on the ground. An ATV had passed through here. Vehicles in the reserve are forbidden for everyone except employees, and then only on special routes. What tourists could we be talking about? At 2:20 p.m., I saw what I was looking for. In a small valley, hidden on all sides by dense forest and rocks, there was a camp. 5 large military-style tents, an open shed with equipment, 2 ATVs, and a generator. The area was surrounded by a light fence. I snapped a few pictures, trying to capture as much detail as possible. Under the canopy, I could see what looked like lab equipment. There was a man standing by one of the tents with a rifle. Didn't look much like a tourist. Everything indicated that this was not a scientific expedition or a research group. They didn't look like explorers, neither by their outfit nor by their behavior. I noticed 3 other men moving between the tents, all of sturdy build, all wary. But what really alarmed me was the smell. Even from a distance, with a certain wind direction, I could smell the chemical odor of solvents and something else pungent, unnatural for the taiga. Suddenly, one of the men raised his head and looked directly in my direction. Instinctively, I froze, pressing myself into the rocks. I don't think he noticed me, but something alerted him. He beckoned to the others, pointing toward the ridge. They immediately scurried about, wrapping and packing something. Not waiting to be discovered, I carefully retreated and, choosing a bypass path, headed toward the cordon. It was important to preserve the information and get it to someone I could trust. When I got back to my house, the first thing I did was copy the photos onto a flash drive. Something told me that I should not expect an official reaction. Did the director of the reserve know about this camp? Or did he just not want any problems with potentially dangerous violators? In the evening, I called Michael. the same police friend who had once brought me to the reserve. In recent years, he had risen to chief of the narcotics division at the regional office. If anyone could make sense of the situation without attracting attention, it was him. I briefly outlined the situation, omitting the director's strange reaction. Michael listened silently, only occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Do you realize what you've stumbled upon, Leica? Judging by the description, this is an illegal laboratory, most likely synthesizing methamphetamine or something similar. The wildlife refuge is the perfect place. No one goes in there without authorization. Few employees. Huge area." After a brief thought, he added, "Keep your head down. I'll get my guys up there, but not without an official request. We need to figure out who's behind this before we launch an official operation. It'll be a purely reconnaissance trip. We'll look, record, determine the composition of the participants. In the meantime, pretend you haven't discovered anything." I spent the next 3 days in agonizing anticipation. I made my usual rounds, but stayed away from Cedar Cape. Whoever had left the note was risking his life. How dangerous were the tourist camp people? On the evening of the third day, Michael made contact. His voice sounded strained. "Alex, we've done some research. You were right. It's an underground drug lab. Quite large, producing synthetics for the whole region. But there's a problem. Among the organizers are people with serious cover. Your director of the Krasner Preserve is in on it. He gets a cut for providing cover and no inspections in that area." I felt my back grow cold. Krasner is a respected scientist, a manager with 20 years of experience, author of monographs on the ecology of Lake Baikal. And he's covering for drug traffickers? "What now?" I asked, already guessing the answer. "We're preparing an operation, a large-scale one involving SOBR, but we need to act extremely carefully. They have their informants. Don't say a word to anyone, not even to your fellow Algerians." In the morning, I went out on my usual detour along the southern route, defiantly far from Cedar Cape. But in my backpack was a special frequency walkie-talkie, handed down by Michaelim for emergency communications. I returned in the dark. Already approaching the cordon, I saw light in the windows, although I remember exactly that I did not leave it on. I carefully walked around the house and looked through the window. Krasner was sitting at my desk, leafing through my work journal. An unfamiliar man in camouflage was standing next to me. Quietly retreating to the woods, I turned on my walkie-talkie. "Michael, I have a problem. Krasner is with some type at my house. Looks like they're looking for something." "Get out of there now!" There was alarm in his friend's voice. "Go east toward the river. There's an abandoned hut 2 kilometers away. Hide there. We are accelerating the operation. The group will be moving out in an hour." I took off my backpack, took out the essentials, and transferred them into a small bag. I hid the rest in the hollow of an old cedar tree. Who knows if I'd have to come back for the stuff. It was starting to rain. That was good. It would wash away the tracks faster. I moved without a lantern, orienting myself by the gaps in the crowns and the noise of the river. For years in the Taiga, my eyes had gotten used to seeing in the dark enough not to trip over roots. The winter house was dilapidated, but the roof was intact, and that was the main thing. I nestled in a corner, wrapped in a waterproof sheet. There was no communication, so all I could do was wait and hope that the operation would be a success. I woke up to the sound of a helicopter engine. Judging by the sun, it was about 6 in the morning. The helicopter passed over the forest toward Cedar Cape. A few minutes later, there was the sound of distant muffled pops, either gunshots or the explosion of stun grenades. By noon, it had quieted down. I ventured out to the river where communications were better and turned on the radio. "Michael, what's the situation?" The radio hissed for a few seconds. Then came the tired but satisfied voice of a friend. "All right, Leica. We got the whole group. 6 people in the camp and 3 on the way. Equipment, finished products, precursors, everything is fixed. Krasnera was also detained when he tried to destroy documents in his office." I felt the tension of the last few days release. "And who left the note on my door?" A guy from around here. He was forced to work for a drug lab, hauling food, supplies, threatened to kill his family. He couldn't take it anymore and risked alerting the reserve, hoping for help. 2 days later, life in the reserve began to return to normal. An interim director was appointed from among the old staff. And for the first time I felt that the taiga had truly become my home. A home I was ready to protect. But I did not know that the greatest challenges lay ahead, and that the real secrets of the Barguzin Reserve are much deeper than human crimes. February 2018 marked one of the strangest periods during my entire time working in the reserve. The winter was snowy, with hard frosts. Baikal was covered with thick, almost 1 meter thick ice. At such a time, the taiga seems to freeze. Many animals hibernate, birds fly away, and primordial silence envelops everything around. My usual winter route was along the coast, along the ice edge. On clear days, Baikal turned into a huge mirror. The ice was so transparent that you could see the rocky bottom a few meters deep in the holes. In the middle of the month, I noticed an oddity. Every morning on the route, I found tracks of large animals, unusually many for this time of the year. Sable, musk deer, all of them were moving in the same direction, towards Aya Bay, a small bay in the northern part of the reserve. On February 12th, I decided to change the route and follow this unusual movement. Leaving the cordon at 5:30, in 4 hours I covered 14 kilometers through the snow-covered taiga. In my backpack I had a thermos with hot tea, dry rations, spare gloves, navigator, radio, and of course, a carbine. I rarely traveled such distances in winter without a snowmobile, preferring shorter routes. Closer to the bay, the tracks became more and more numerous. In some areas, the snow was literally covered with the prints of different animals, as if the whole taiga had gathered for some important meeting. By 11:20, I reached a high coastal promontory, where I had a view of the whole bay. What I saw made me freeze. Several dozen animals were gathered at the ice edge, about 200 meters from shore. A group of muskrats kept apart, closer to the forest. 4 or 5 wolverines, which usually actively avoid any neighborhood, sat not far from a large colony of sables. Even a few wild boars, a rarity in the snow-covered taiga, froze at the very edge of the ice. But that was not the strangest thing. The animals were not just gathered together. It was as if they were watching something in the water. All stood motionless, staring at one point. A small hole that never froze even in the harshest frosts because of the thermal waters coming out. Settling behind a large cedar tree with binoculars, I continued my observation. The animals showed no signs of aggression and did not hunt each other. It was as if they were waiting for something. Suddenly, around noon, their behavior changed. The razubri raised their heads, the sables stood on their hind legs, and the boars began to stir restlessly. And then I heard it. At first I thought it was a low humming sound, like the distant rumble of a storm. But the sky was clear. There was no wind. The sound grew, pulsing, at times changing into something like a guttural chant or a moan. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I lived near Baikal for 3 years and had heard quite a few of the strange sounds that winter ice makes. But this was something else. These sounds were melodies, almost meaningful phrases in an unfamiliar language. Suddenly, my attention was drawn to a movement near the ice hole. The water in it began to churn, though the day was absolutely windless. A small whirlpool formed as if something invisible was stirring the dark water. I'll be honest, goosebumps ran down my spine. The stories of an old Buryat Ayur, with whom I used to fish sometimes, involuntarily came to my mind. He spoke of Burkhan Babai, the master spirit of Baikal, who on special days rises from the depths to survey his domain. When Burkhan Babai is displeased, he takes people into the dark abysses. When he's happy, he brings good luck. But he appears only before important events. The old man's words came to mind. The observation lasted about an hour. The sound subsided and then grew again. The animals remained motionless, as if enchanted. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The whirlpool disappeared. The sounds were silent. The animals, as if awakened from a trance, began to disperse, some into the forest, some along the shore. I sat there, unable to move, stunned by what I had seen. The rational part of my mind searched for a logical explanation, but I had never encountered such a phenomenon before. In the evening, after returning to the cordon, I called Ayuru. The old man listened to me without surprise. "It is Burhan who is warning. Big trouble is coming, or a great change. He's gathering his children to show them the danger." I wasn't prone to mysticism, but his words made me wonder. What if there was some real basis hidden in the ancient legends of the Taiga peoples? What if they had been observing natural phenomena for centuries that we modern humans have lost the ability to notice? For the next 3 days, I recorded any unusual observations: animal movements, ice conditions, weather anomalies, and every day the strange gathering at the ice hole was repeated. Sometimes the sounds were barely audible. Sometimes they were amplified to such an extent that it seemed that the whole ice was vibrating. On the 4th day, I took a recording device with me. I installed it on the shore and set it to record automatically. I wanted to get an objective confirmation of what was happening. When I listened to the recording in the evening, I was disappointed. Instead of mysterious sounds in the background, I could hear only crackling ice and a slight wind noise. It was as if the technology could not catch what was available to the living ear. On February 19th, the phenomenon stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Animals stopped gathering at the ice hole. The sounds were not repeated. Life in the reserve returned to normal. I almost forgot about this strange incident, writing it off as some rare natural phenomenon. Maybe the special acoustics of the bay created a resonance with the crackling of the ice, or temperature changes caused air fluctuations perceived as sounds. But exactly 1 month later, on March 19, 2018, came news that made me remember Ayer's words about big trouble. The largest environmental disaster in a decade had occurred at Lake Baikal. Several tons of petroleum products had spilled into the lake due to an accident at an illegal pipeline laid in circumvention of all environmental regulations. The consequences lasted for months. The area of pollution was in the southern part of Lake Baikal, 200 kilometers away from the site of our reserve. But when I saw satellite images of the oil slick spreading, I got a shiver. The slick had a shape reminiscent of the whirlpool in the ice hole, which I had observed a month before the disaster. Coincidence? Probably. But something told me that there was a connection between these events that modern science could not yet explain. In the summer, I met with a group of geophysicists who came to study seismic activity in the area of the reserve. I told them about the phenomenon without mentioning the mystical aspect, simply as unusual sounds and animal behavior. The head of the expedition, an elderly professor from Irkutsk, listened with interest. His explanation was unexpected but had a scientific basis. There are underwater thermal springs in this area. They create a difference in water temperature, forming special currents. And where waters of different temperatures and densities meet, there are oscillations that can be transmitted through the ice. Under special conditions, when atmospheric pressure drops or changes dramatically, these vibrations are amplified and become audible. And animals? I asked. Animals are much more sensitive than we are to infrasound and ground vibrations. They may have been responding to seismic precursors that precede earthquakes or other geologic processes. Many disasters are accompanied by abnormal animal behavior days or weeks before the event. His explanation was logical, scientific, and yet some part of me continued to doubt. The behavior of the different species seemed too purposeful, too meaningful. Those strange voices sounded. Not knowing who was right, modern science or ancient legends, I took the middle ground. Maybe our ancestors, lacking scientific knowledge, simply explain natural phenomena differently that we can decipher today with instruments and theories. But maybe they notice connections and patterns that we, with all our technology, have simply become unable to see. Since then, I've been listening more closely to the Taiga and its thousands of years of wisdom. And when in the summer of 2019, I again noticed an unusual gathering of animals near one of the distant bays, I immediately remembered Burhan Babai and his warnings. But what I encountered next turned out to be scarier than any legends and more inexplicable than any scientific theories. And I had to make a decision alone, on which the lives of several people depended, including my own. May 2019. 4 years have passed since I first crossed the threshold of my cordon in the Bargazine Nature Reserve. A lot has changed in that time, both in the reserve and in myself. After the story of the drug lab and the mystical phenomena at Baikal, I began to perceive the Taiga differently. It was no longer just a place of work or a refuge from the past. It became home, with all its mysteries, dangers, and wonders. I no longer try to explain everything that happens only by logic or only by mysticism. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. Sometimes I go ashore and listen to the sounds of Baikal. In the noise of the waves, I catch something like voices, be it an acoustic phenomenon or messages from Burhan Babai. Old Ayur says that I have begun to understand the language of the Taiga. Maybe he's right. Maybe it's just something that time and careful observation teaches. I still remember my family every day, but the pain of loss no longer paralyzes me, but gives me strength to move on. Anna and Catherine remain with me in memories and dreams, and here, in reality, I now have a new life and a new purpose, to be the guardian of this amazing place. The gamekeeper's trail is endless, and I am willing to walk it for as long as it takes. This is the end of the story of the gamekeeper Alex, a man who found not only a new home in the harsh taiga, but also himself. His journey from a man lost in grief to an experienced guardian of protected lands is a story of how nature heals the deepest wounds if we are ready to listen to her voice. What do you think? Is there a fine line between science and mysticism in such remote corners of the planet as the Barguzin Reserve? Can modern people really understand ancient legends and beliefs of local peoples? And most importantly, do you believe that untouched nature can speak to those who are ready to hear it? Tell us in the comments about your experience of meeting the unexplainable in the forest or mountains. Perhaps you have your own taiga story to share. If you liked this story, put a like and subscribe to the channel. There are many new stories ahead about those who chose to live away from the noise of the city, alone with wild nature. Stories of people for whom the taiga has become not just a place of work, but a true calling. Take care of yourselves and the nature around us. See you in the next issues.